Hi there, I have a thought for the day, and this thought comes from The Dance of the Dissident Daughter. And it's by Sue Monk Kidd. And it's a story of awakening to your own power, and in her case, to being a woman. It was autumn, and everything was turning loose. I was running errands that afternoon. Rain had fallen earlier, but now the sun was out, shining on the tiny beads of water that clung to trees and sidewalks. The whole world seemed red and yellow and rinsed with light. I parked in front of the drugstore where my daughter, Anne, who was 14, had an after-school job. Leaping a puddle, I went inside. I spotted her right away, kneeling on the floor in the toothpaste section, stocking a bottom shelf. I was just about to walk over and say hello when I noticed two middle-aged men walking along the aisle toward her. They looked like everybody's father. They had moused hair, and they wore knit sport shirts the color of Easter eggs, the kind of shirts with tiny alligators sewn at the chest. It was a detail I would remember later as having ironic symbolism. My daughter did not see them coming. Kneeling on the floor, she was intent on getting the boxes of Crest lined up evenly. The men stopped peering down at her. One man nudged the other and said, "Now that's how I like to see a woman, on her knees." The other man laughed. Standing in the next aisle, I froze. I watched the expression that crept into my daughter's eyes as she looked up. I watched her chin drop and her hair fall across her face. Seeing her kneel at these men's feet while they laughed at her subordinate position pierced me through and through. For the previous couple of years, I had been in the midst of a tumultuous awakening. I had been struggling to come to terms with my life as a woman in my culture, my marriage, my faith, my church, and deep inside myself. It was a process not unlike the experience of conception and labor. There had been a moment, many moments really, when truth seized me and I conceived myself as a woman. Or maybe I reconceived myself. At any rate, it had been extraordinary and surprising to find myself, a conventionally religious woman in my late 30s, suddenly struck pregnant with a new consciousness, with an unfolding new awareness of what it means to be a woman and what it means to be spiritual as a woman. Hard labor had followed. For months, I'd inched along, but lately I'd been stuck. I'd awakened enough to know that I couldn't go back to my old way of being a woman, but the fear of going forward was paralyzing. So I plodded along, trying to make room for the new consciousness that was unfolding in my life, but without really risking change. I have a friend, a nurse on the obstetrical floor at a hospital, who says sometimes a woman's labor simply stalls. The contractions grow weak and the new life, now quite distressed, hangs precariously. The day I walked into the drugstore, I was experiencing something like that, a stalled awakening. Who knows? I may have stalled interminably if I had not seen my daughter on her knees before those laughing men. I cannot to this day explain why the sight of it hit me so forcibly. But to borrow Kafka's image, it came like an ice axe upon a frozen sea, and all of a sudden, all of my hesitancy was shattered, just like that. The men's laughter seemed to go on and on. I felt like a small animal in the road, blinded by the light of a truck, knowing some terrible collision was coming and unable to move. I stared at my daughter on her knees before these men, and I could not look away. Somehow she seemed more than my daughter. She was my mother, my grandmother, and myself. She was every woman ever born, bent and contained in a small, ageless cameo that bore the truth about a woman's place. In the profile of my daughter, I saw the suffering of women, the confining of the feminine to places of inferiority, and I experienced a collision of love and pain so great that I had to reach for the counter to brace myself. This posture will not perpetuate itself in her life, I decided. Still, I didn't know what to do. When I was growing up, if my mother had told me once, she'd told me 1,000 times, if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. I'd heard this from nearly everybody. It was the kind of thing that got cross-stitched and hung in kitchens all over my native South. I'd grown up to be a soft-voiced, sweet-mouthed woman who, no matter how assailing the behavior before me or how much I disagreed with it, I responded nicely, or else ziplocked my mouth shut. I had swallowed enough defiant, disputatious words in my life to fill a shelf of books. But it occurred to me that if I abandoned my daughter at that moment, if I simply walked away and was silent, the feminine spirit unfolding inside of her might also become crouched and silent. Perhaps she would learn the internal posture of being on her knees. The men, with their blithe joke, had no idea they had tapped a reservoir of pain and defiance in me, and it was rising now, unstoppable by any earthly force. I walked toward them. I have something to say to you, and I want you to hear it, I said. They stopped laughing and looked up. This is my daughter, I said, pointing to her, my finger shaking with anger. You may like to see her and other women on their knees, but we don't belong there. We don't belong there. Anne rose to her feet. She glanced sideways at me. Sheer amazement spread over her face, and then turned and faced the men. I could hear her breath rise and fall with her chest as we stood there, shoulder to shoulder, staring at their faces. Women, one of them said. They walked away, leaving Anne and me staring at each other among the toothpaste and the dental floss. I smiled at her. She smiled back. And though we didn't say a word, more was spoken in that moment than perhaps in our whole lives. I left the drugstore that day so internally jolted by the experience that everything in me began to shift. I sat in the car feeling like a newborn, dangled upside down and slapped. Throughout my awakening, I'd grown increasingly aware of certain attitudes that existed in our culture, a culture long dominated by men. The men in the drugstore had mirrored one attitude in particular, that of seeking power over another, of staying up by keeping others down. Sitting in my car and replaying my statement back to those men that women did not belong on their knees, I knew I had uttered my declaration of intent. That night, Anne came to my room. I was sitting in bed reading. She climbed up beside me and said, Mama, about this afternoon in the drugstore? Yeah, I said. I just wanted to say thanks. So as you go through your day, ask yourself, have you taken an internal posture of always being on your knees, always crouching in fear, afraid to say what you need to say? Do you need a big jolt in order to come to life again. Because if you do, if you need that big jolt, you're going to get it. Take care and have a great day.